Hij is een reader of biodiversity op de Manchester Metropolitan University. Research Associate van het Cornell Lab of Ornithology aan het Cornell University. En onder andere ook voorzitter van de Britse CDNA. Sinds zijn 7e gefascineerd door trekvogels. En vanuit die passie heeft hij ook een boek geschreven. U raadt het misschien al, Vagrancy in Birds. Hij is hier om ons een snapshot te geven over dit fascinerende onderwerp. En ik denk voor velen van ons ook een van de highlights van de dag. Dus dames en heren, mag ik een daverend applaus voor Alexander Lees.
Thank you. Yep, all good. Okay, good morning, everyone. Apologies for when he delivered in English. Great to see so many faces that I've not seen for a very long time, some of which I haven't seen for 20 or 30 years. Super excited to come to this event. First time I've been to this, the Vogeldag, and amazed at how exciting a lot of the talks are here. I end up going to the bird fair every year and they're pitched so much lower. So, I mean, fantastic talk from Peter earlier on, so many questions. And I guess my talk, rather than being something incredibly specific and a brilliant story, is going to be, I guess, a whirlwind tour of all sorts of stuff, which might be a bit discombobulated, but I hope it's of broad interest. So, most of the work that I do, to be honest, isn't to do with vagrancy. It's to do with understanding biodiversity responses to global change. So I'm really sort of interested in how the Anthropocene is shaping communities, primarily of birds, because I'm a colossal bird nerd, but also of other groups as well. I've been sort of writing papers about avian vagrancy, though, for about, I guess, 20 or so years now, but mostly in the sort of capacity as someone that's interested, like everyone here, is like a hobbyist, right? All of us are fascinated by rare birds, and many of us don't just go and consume those birds. We also wonder, why they got here. So this has been a sort of an overarching driving thing, which has always been in the background for me. But what's really exciting is that in recent years, we've had so many new sort of scientific technologies which have appeared, which are really, and driven largely not by myself, by other up-and-coming early career researchers like Paul Dufour and Joe Wynn, who are going to start answering some of the questions that some of us have just been erecting hypotheses and arguing about for a long time. So I think the next 10 years will usher in a much more holistic understanding of why rare birds turn up when they do. So 2 examples on the front here, dark-sided or Siberian flycatcher and Aleutian tern, which are sort of, in many ways, sort of go-to records for me for how sort of astounding some of these feats of movement that birds undertake, right? There's a record of Siberian flycatcher from Bermuda, sort of Western Atlantic Ocean, and then year I was born even, this sole record of Aleutian tern from the Western Palearctic. And most papers historically on vagrants have been, published in bird journals, often sort of non-specialist ones, if you like, by societies, and are very descriptive. But we're starting to move beyond that now, and not just going from the sort of describing patterns, but getting towards the idea of processes. I guess maybe there's a new sort of go-to record for an incredible record of a bird, which has become available for slides only in the last couple of weeks. And I'm ashamed to say that I haven't been yet, but hoping to go tomorrow, so fingers crossed I won't have a very disappointing ride back home tomorrow evening. So I want to broadly talk about, the sort of what, who, when, where, and whys, but also why should we care, right? I mean, again, we care as birders and ornithologists because we want to see these things, these birds that might be half a world away, but we're increasingly sort of realizing it's not just people that are excited about adding a bird to a list that should care. I think there's an increasing understanding that these birds may have quite an important ecological processes which they may be responsible for. And I guess we have to start with this fundamental question, right? What is a vagrant? And it might seem obvious what is a vagrant and what isn't, but really it's just a line in the sand, I guess, we have to draw between a species which occurs regularly and a species which occurs irregularly, I guess. So a short-toed tree creeper is a bird which probably one within 150 meters of this building now, right? And yet, in the United Kingdom, it's a species with less than 32 records. So in the UK, we would always think of that as being a rare vagrant. Wryneck is a bird which we historically lost in Britain as a breeder, and we only get nowadays, it very rarely, regularly breeds here. Nowadays, we really only get the species as a passage migrant, so birders would often describe it as a scarce passage migrant and wouldn't perhaps describe it as a vagrant. But fundamentally, there's no major difference between these two things, right? Wrynecks, which occur as drift migrants on the east coast of the United Kingdom, they don't want to be there. They're no longer on their regular migration course. So in many ways, they have become a vagrant. So these descriptive terms, really, we need to sort of look at it as a continuum and as a line in the sand. So to add a few more layers of definitions then, so vagrancy itself is fundamentally when we find an individual of a species outside of its normal geographic range, right? We have in our heads this circumscribed distributions, which we see, in field guides, and also worth bearing in mind that these are incredibly dynamic and change rapidly in space and time. Great egrets in the United Kingdom and indeed here, if you look back 30, 40, 50 years ago, incredibly rare birds, and now colonists, and we're rewriting distribution maps as well. In our book, published a couple of years ago, we sort of also tried to split this idea of vagrancy in terms of thinking about what drives vagrancy as a process. So we have this idea of endogenous, so vagrancy with an internal cause. So, something that's wrong with the bird, some inability to navigate correctly, or an internal driver, which means that this individual ends up far from where it would normally be. And then exogenous or external causes, the most commonly referenced to which is the weather, right? Whenever you see an article in the popular press about vagrancy, people always say it's blown by the wind, which may be correct in many cases, but perhaps is wider the mark in many others. And then the question of, well, which species? So vagrancy is actually documented through almost all of the avian orders and most of the avian families. And again, when we talk about circumscribing a species' geographic range, you can imagine you're somewhere in the cloud forest in Colombia, and you might see a Cytalopus tapaculo, which was 400 meters out of range, and in a life zone below its area where it regularly occurs. And one might describe that as a vagrant, because this species is incredibly sedentary, and yet, if you were to look at where all the individuals of the species are, you would find 99.9999 whatever % of those individuals within this set area. So, depending on the bird's capacity for dispersal, a vagrancy event might be might be across distances which are incredibly small. So thinking about this the spatial nature of what we describe as vagrancy is probably quite useful. This is from a paper led by Paul, we published last year, and we have here elegant tern, which essentially almost all the world's population breeds in the Gulf of California here, with a few colonies in Southern California as well, and the winters across broad extent to the Pacific. And yet this species is a relatively regular vagrant on the US coast and in Europe, and has now been recorded breeding extralimitary in Spain. So incredible to think that you've got probably 99.999% of the bird's population circumscribed within a relatively small area here, and yet we have these disjunct records from Europe. And understanding the significance of that is something we're just trying to get into now. And again, for the benefit of people that don't like birds, which is often my students, but then won't be anyone in this room, vagrancy is not a process which is just an avian one. It's perhaps best described in birds because there's so many amateur ornithologists, amateur naturalists cataloguing these things. But of course, it happens across all sorts of other groups. There's a nice figure here for keyhole glider, which is a migratory species of Ozonata. And there's vagrant records from northern South America, and from Linosa in Italy, and then from Persian Gulf, although this species actually overflies the Indian Ocean here. So another example, like sort of phocids, pinnipeds and cetaceans are well known for wandering. Obviously, the capacity to disperse in water as a medium is far easier than for terrestrial land mammals, which have more of a struggle to be vagrants, although there are some good examples. A go-to example for me is a record of a mountain lion, which was tagged in, I think it was in the Black Hills in Dakota in the western US, and ended up being run over in Connecticut and walked about 3,000 kilometers. So essentially, it recapitulated the former range of an extinct subspecies of mountain lion, but still fundamentally a vagrant because it had gone, a long, long way. In the UK, obviously, we're not blessed with much terrestrial mammal vagrancy apart from a few bats, but we do get lots of vagrant cetaceans and pinnipeds, etc. So, example here of a subantarctic fur seal. This is its regular range here, and vagrants quite widespread in the southern oceans. Again, you're thinking of the consequences of this. Well, major consequences for gene flow, hybridization, dispersal, in terms of how speciation functions. If you're regularly getting sort of vagrant propagules arriving at areas where you may already have a disjunct population, then speciation is inhibited. So an understanding of this process can shed light on various evolutionary processes. Does anyone, this image, I guess, which is one of mine, I guess it's almost a bit, brings back memories of recent events, perhaps on Texel, right? Does anyone know what these people here were looking at? Long-billed murrelet, yeah. So also a seabird from the Pacific Northwest. This was at the time the second Western Palearctic record. Drew lots of attention from the press, army of twitchers, etc., etc. And not unlike Texel, it does have this sort of militarized scene, if you think of all the people standing on the edge of the ramparts to view this species. Long-billed murrelet has this. This is its entire sort of world range, breeding up here in Kamchatka, Chukotka, and wintering further south towards the sort of Japan. And these are extralimital records. These just downloaded from eBird. There are a few more. The first European record isn't marked there. There's records south of sort of China here. This creational amazing spread of vagrancy is sort of indicative that, unlike perhaps the Ida, which would seem most likely to have come perhaps across the top here, it seems like the long-billed murrelet probably came across the entirety of North America to get to the Western Palearctic. And what's incredible is that there are more records of long-billed murrelet from Florida than there are of little auk, which is a species which occurs, within the same ocean. And why this happens, well, we don't understand why. What we do know, for instance, from a paper published a few years ago, is that long-billed murrelets that occur in the interior of North America are actually in reasonably good body condition. It's not like they're doing very badly or whatever. They'll stop for a few days and be fishing and then moving on. So it's not like these things are storm-driven. Yeah, there's something which is underpinning these movements which we don't quite understand, but I'd hope, maybe if I was invited to give this talk in 15 years or invite someone cleverer than me in 15 years, we might have a good answer to what's going on. Again, the previous papers here, this is prior to the split from marble murrelet. Again, descriptive ones, but moving towards some more sort of quantitative appraisal of what's going on. And then at one extreme, we have long-billed murrelet, a bird from half a hemisphere away with a British record and multiple Western Palearctic records, and yet, there is no documented record of black woodpecker, again, a bird which is probably one within a kilometre of here right now, from the United Kingdom. So obviously, amongst this sort of clade of organisms, there's a huge variation in capacity for dispersal. I already mentioned the sort of Cytalopus tapaculos and the antbirds that I work on in the Amazon basin. We know that some of these species, despite the fact they can nominally fly, they can literally fly for no more than 50 or so meters. And then at the other extreme, we have the Bowery race of bar-tailed godwits that sort of shocked the ornithological community about 10 years ago now, when we realized they could, undertake a single sustained flight of 11,000 kilometers, which lasted for 7 days. So a huge variation in capacity, which almost certainly underpins which species occur, where and when. And woodpeckers, although there are some migratory species, the most migratory of which, the sort of wryneck we mentioned earlier on, are among a group of taxa which have a very, very low capacity of dispersal. Indeed, the whole of the island of Madagascar doesn't have any woodpeckers. Indeed, it has a primate there which fulfills the woodpecker niche in the eye with its long, crazy-looking fingers or whatever to eke out grubs from bark. So clearly, dispersal itself shapes the communities of birds and other species we found throughout the world. A while back, I spent a season at a bird observatory in Canada and met someone called Ian McLaren, who sadly passed away recently, and we talked about the idea of trying to sort of get at what are the sort of traits of bird species which underpin vagrancy. So at the time, we took some data from sort of migration counts from sites in North America and from tower kills, etc. At that time, there was no massive sort of citizen science data sets that we could mine for information. And we looked at various different species traits to try and explain, which North American land birds were recurring as vagrants to Europe. And what we found, well, larger body size was a great predictor. Longer wing length, and this should make sense in the sense that the larger body birds probably have greater sort of lipid content, so they've got more fat, so they can potentially fly for longer. Again, longer wings, so more efficient flight. Nowadays, we'd be repeating this, we would use Kip's distance, which is an even better proxy for dispersal capacity, which is just a sort of measure of how pointed a species' wings are. Whether species have a long migration span already is a great predictor, because if you've already got those sort of ecophysiological adaptations for long over water or long flights, large population size makes sense. If your species is more abundant, then there's just more individuals to become vagrants. And then, intriguingly, in the context of the Palearctic, species which occur as later migrants are also more likely to be vagrants, simply because later on in the season we have more sort of powerful storm systems which rush across the Atlantic. A good example of a species which would tick most of these boxes would be purple martin, and yet it's a species with very few European records, simply because it's a species which moves much earlier. So it's not being caught up in these storm systems, but it's a species which has probably got remarkably high capacity to not be drifted, and to potentially to fight against wind drift, which may be why many sort of North American hirundines are quite rare in the Palearctic. Red-eyed vireo is the commonest North American land bird vagrant to Europe, and it ticks all of these boxes. It's abundant, super long-winged. They migrate all the way to sort of the eastern Amazon. It's hyper-abundant, and it moves relatively late as well. So you can easily explain which species occur and which species don't, sort of just using these sort of trait-specific approaches. Population size is something which is sort of increasingly sort of become apparent is a really good predictor of vagrancy. There's a guy, Richard Veet, who's written a lot about this. I think Richard believes that almost all vagrancy is predicted by sort of changes in population size, which is not something I necessarily subscribe to, but I think there's plenty of evidence that species with expanding populations are likely to be more likely to be recorded as vagrants. And this might not just because there's more individuals, it might be sort of alley effects or impacts where, as a species is expanding its range, you'll get species, individuals which will try and found new subpopulations or colonize new areas, rather than if the species range was contracting, then species are more likely to, especially migration species are more likely to settle closer to towards the range core, etc. So there may be sort of interactions, basically, based on population size. So obviously species which are common are more likely to be higher vagrancy likelihood, but species which have populations which are expanding may have higher rates of vagrancy. But again, there's plenty of potential exceptions to this rule. Something that springs to mind might be sociable lapwing, for instance, which is a species which is now critically endangered, and yet still occurs quite regularly as a vagrant to Europe. So perhaps in that case, it's sort of an impact where as the population gets smaller and smaller and smaller, then individual sociable lapwings might end up tagging on with groups of northern lapwings and then end up sort of abmigrating and moving with those birds towards Europe simply because they're unable to find a flock of conspecifics, a flock of their own species. So there are reasons that, to think that this might not always be the case, that population growth rates or even population size are necessarily great predictors of vagrancy. Although, again, there's a sort of neat paper here out a couple of years ago that explains well, for instance, that something that many people here will have noticed, which is the sort of decline in number of records of ring-billed gulls. Now, ring-billed gulls populations in North America peaked in the sort of 1990s and have been declined since then. And we've seen this corresponding change in the status of the species as a vagrant to everyone, Western Europe, to be honest. I mean, when the species was really in its sort of ascension phase here in the 1970s, there were flocks of 20 and 30 in beaches in South Wales, and the species, which is currently not considered a rarity, official rarity in the UK, as it were, is at risk of being added back onto that list because there's now relatively few, and a lot of those individuals we do have in circulation are adults, and we're getting relatively few sort of first winter birds. So a huge sort of change in status, whereas other species are often increasing. I mean, Bonaparte's gull, one in particular. Bonaparte's gull itself, a challenge, because maybe we didn't have the amount of knowledge about identification criteria of the species, 40, 50 years ago. So much more observer awareness these days. But it seems that the increase is a genuine one and isn't just a consequence of people going out looking more for Bonaparte's gulls, for instance. So just thinking more about some of those drivers, those internal and external ones. So of the internal drivers, then vagrancy is not something which is only associated with migratory species, right? We get sedentary species which can also occur as vagrants. This likely occurs because most individuals, birds, mammals, whatever, in their first year of life, if they're species which hold a territory, then they must disperse away from their natal area to try and find and establish a territory of their own. Most individuals as sedentary species obviously don't move very far. But again, if you look at data on virtually any individual organism you can find, you will find a long tail of records of vagrants. Now, that might not be spectacular and in the order of hundreds or thousands of kilometers, but that tail is visible. So some individuals do end up moving further and further. And again, what would be intriguing, and this will probably almost certainly come out of some of these sort of big data studies and tracking studies, is understanding what are the proportion of individuals which undertake these sorts of movements, and even understanding why those individuals. Is this something random, or is it something about the landscape context, for instance, that they're located in? One would assume, for instance, if you're a species which you're something of a habitat specialist, so you have a relatively narrow sort of eco-physiological tolerance of different habitats. Imagine if you're a desert species and your territory or where you were born is right at the edge of that biome. If you were to disperse out of that habitat and into non-suitable habitat, presumably you will keep traveling for quite a while until you find suitable habitat. So it's quite possible that individuals at the edge of the range of sedentary species might be more predisposed to vagrancy, which is again counterintuitive because there ought to be fewer of those individuals than there are individuals at the range core. But I'd imagine we will, in the next few years, start to get answers to these sorts of questions. And I'll give you an example in a minute. One which has intrigued people for a long time is this notion that many migrants are unable to navigate correctly in some way, and therefore vagrancy has an internal cause which results from some failure to navigate, be that underpinned at some genetic or potentially environmental level, and there's been all sorts of hypotheses erected to explain this. Reverse migration and mirror image and scatter vagrancy, etc., etc. And this is something I'm not going to talk at length today about, but is something we should hopefully arrive at some sort of answer fairly soon because of these sort of new toolkits like sort of gene escaping and in combination with orientation experiments and more sort of targeted tracking of migrant birds. So I think we're probably not far off within 5 years to have a reasonably good understanding of some of these internal drivers. Another one, which is perhaps more simple, is just a failure of migrants to stop migrating at appropriate time. A phenomenon in the Northern Hemisphere we think about of overshooting, something we often think about happening in spring, the arrival of, well, I'd say once upon a time, bee-eaters in the Netherlands, but that's now a taxon which is going to be probably breeding quite commonly here within a few decades. But think of any southern European species which is migrating north, a failure to arrest migration at the appropriate time, something which should be genetically coded into the individual, whether it be that a genetic issue, or perhaps just encouraged north by clement weather conditions or whatever it is, will lead to vagrancy. And we know that some of these individuals are able to quickly reorientate and move back towards their regular range. And of course, overshooting doesn't only occur in the spring migration, it also occurs in the autumn migration. Not something we see that much of here, but if you're going down to South Africa or the southern cone of South America, then we see these autumn overshoots of New World wood warblers, for instance, to Brazil, or of things like citrine wagtail to South Africa. So the same phenomenon also occurs in autumn. Controversially, I guess, well, not even controversially, hypothetically, there's some information out there which is very scanty from sort of autopsies of specimens of vagrants and some historical collecting effort in places like Alaska, that vagrants often seem to have quite a high proportion of individuals with sort of anomalous body condition, evidence of injury or disease, parasitism, tumours, and this sort of thing. So there isn't any robust evidence of whether or not these are cause and effect, but it's intriguing enough that this may be quite important. Again, quite often vagrant birds end up staying a while, and then they end up dying, and then they end up being autopsied, and they have some sort of condition. Quite often we don't know whether that's a consequence of them being massively out of habitat. So a cream-coloured courser on the Isles of Scilly died of a fungal infection, but it spent a month, on a wet coastal headland in southwest England. So it's quite likely that that bird simply became ill because it was in England. I sympathise. And it wasn't something that had driven the bird's vagrancy, but who knows? And then we have these external, exogenous causes. Weather is obviously the big one. We'll talk a little bit about that. Incredibly excitingly, now we have this, the idea that space weather, this sort of phenomenon. I guess everyone here also was able to see the amazing auroras we've had this year in this sort of 12-year cycle. But we now have an understanding, I've got a couple of slides on this, that this sort of astronomical phenomenon can also impact bird migration. There are biological drivers, so eruptions driven by variation in food resources, incredibly important, especially for boreal species. And then the tricky one is we live in this Anthropocene, and the ability for birds to sort of hitchhike on boats or even by other crazy means. I mean, there's records of things on planes, or then we have all sorts of challenges with understanding, or records committees do, and it's obviously the bane of my life, these sorts of questions, because one could argue that climate change impacts are a consequence of the Anthropocene and are as unnatural potentially as boats or oil rigs or whatever. But these are the sort of decisions that we have to take as rarities committees. And again, there are other phenomena that have been other explanations that have been set up to explain some of these. So there's a neat example here. This is a red-shouldered hawk of the sort of western subspecies. It's quite a sort of a disjunct range in the western US here, and just bleeding into Mexico here. So there was a really cool cohort-based ringing study on this species. So of about 1,000 red-shouldered hawks which were ringed, they got recoveries from like 10% of those. And of those birds, most basically moved less than 100 kilometers. So short distance dispersers. This is a species which, the western subspecies is non-migratory. It's not like this eastern migratory taxon. 10 of those individuals moved over 100 kilometers, so they sort of put that in the bin of being long distance dispersers. And 3, so still 2.5% of all those birds, were essentially vagrants. And we see those sort of records here. For a resident raptor, these individuals moved, massively, massively out of range. And again, they also came from sort of a range core as well. If you imagine that you'd expected this individual here perhaps to come from the tip of Baja California, but no, it was from the range core. So even in a ostensibly resident raptor, we had individuals in a sedentary species which ended up moving, a long, long way out of range. And the more we have these sorts of data sets, the more we can sort of get a better handle on expected rates of vagrancy amongst sedentary taxa. The genus Tyrannus, so this is fork-tailed flycatcher, has sort of long been a hobby horse of mine. Simply because if you want to model organism, then to understand migration and vagrancy, especially if you're reliant on citizen science data, is that you want something which is easily recognizable, right? I'm interested in all sorts of other taxa to use as model species, and again, sort of working with Paul on yellow-browed warblers. But, you know, if I lived in the States, I wouldn't expect my non-birding mother or grandmother or sister or brother or whatever to recognize a yellow-browed warbler. But, you know, if you're out of range and a scissor-tail flycatcher lands on your washing line, you're like, what the hell is that thing? So we have great data on this species. And what do we see for a bird which has a relatively restricted breeding range in the sort of southern US, migrates to Central America? The spread of vagrancy in this species is pretty phenomenal. And it's in every cardinal compass direction away from the breeding range. We see, this is again, is a line in the sand here of where we draw the end of the distribution map. So there's a buffer here of 100 kilometers on this map. And obviously there are more records closer to where the bulk of the species are, but then we get these sort of effects of the birds piling up on the coast, and this is sort of Appalachia here with very few records. Obviously, this is bad habitat for a scissor-tail flycatcher, and there's fewer birders, so you obviously get more coastal effects, you get this coastal bias. But fundamentally, there are records all over the shop, and now we have, you know, a few records from North and South America. It wouldn't surprise me if someone ended up with a record of the species in Peru in a few years' time, for instance. But I think choosing which species to study and choosing which system is helpful, and the Western Hemisphere is useful for answering these questions simply because there are more birders and there are more data. Trying to understand what's going on with Siberian vagrants is so much more challenging because there are no data from the bulk of the species range. There are so little data available, even in Russian publications, you know, from the Urals and such like, to understand rates of vagrancy, that it becomes a lot easier to ask them these questions of birds from the Western Hemisphere. Having said that, the mystery of yellow-browed warblers, Philospis ornatus, you know, is one which inspires everyone. And we are getting closer and closer to understanding, you know, what is going on with this species. This is a paper, I wasn't involved with this, led by Paul, which sort of set out what we would expect if this species were nominally a sort of a pseudo-vagrant, essentially. A pseudo-vagrancy was a term that myself and James Gilroy coined about 20 or so years ago now. The idea that some species might not be vagrants in the sense that they're lost and one-off and destined, you know, never to reproduce, but they might be individuals which are on a unique and novel migration heading, which they have inherited from their parents, which also undertook their sort of journey. So the idea that it might be individuals founding new populations, but which are occurring at very low density. So in this paper, Paul and co sort of set out what would be expected if this phenomenon were happening. And one of the key facets of this is, well, we should expect lots of adults, for instance. And we should expect species to be returning on a yearly basis, et cetera, et cetera. And what have we found? So Paul had a recent paper in IBIS which showed, for instance, for yellow-browed warblers, there's very little evidence of adults of this species occurring in Europe. But in the same paper, they had sort of controls for common chiffchaff, Colobita, and then for Tristis chiffchaff, Tristis. And they found that for Tristis, there was like 30% of birds were adults. So seemingly, the Tristis chiffchaffs we're regularly seeing moving through Europe might well be on the start of something new. So we're moving sort of towards answering some of these questions. These are ringing recoveries, for instance, for yellow-browed warblers, and a lot of them seem to be moving in this southwesterly heading. One assumes that many of these birds, which give us so much sort of joy every autumn, do probably literally end up dead in the North Atlantic, which is incredibly sort of sad, I guess, to think about that. But we have to then ask the question, so if these birds aren't returning, and we get so many of them, what is driving this process? And that is a question, again, which we may be fairly close to answering using these sort of genoscaping tools, trying to understand what were the source region for these birds. If you're all coming from a similar area, might it be some environmental cue or problem with navigation for birds in a certain region which is sending them off course? So again, sort of hold fire for maybe some answers on this question fairly soon. And then there was an interesting paper, a speculative paper published in Trends in Parasitology, again, May 2024, right? All these papers are all coming in quick succession, this sort of renewed and rekindled quantitative interest in vagrancy by Stefan Bench et al., suggesting that, again, parasitism might have impacts on misorientation. Several of us were sort of shocked by this paper, and we're sort of scratching our heads about it, but it is a hypothesis which is valid and needs to be tested. So maybe it's another sort of endogenous, if you like, cause of vagrancy in the strictest sense of still being a biological cause, but which is within the bird itself, I guess. And then what everyone always talks about, fundamentally, is the weather, right? Instead of misorientation, we have disorientation. So a bird which is heading on its correct heading is pushed away from that heading by fundamentally the weather. And again, there's been so much learned within the last decade or so that we've seen an entire new field of ecology, sort of aeroecology, which has emerged. The understanding of the sky as habitat for birds, and we should always sort of come to think about our own sort of biases, I guess. And we are a diurnal, visually orientated primate which lives on the ground, right? Our understanding of what happens in the air is quite limited. I mean, I say it's quite limited. I mean, yesterday I took a flight here in an amber weather warning, and I can tell you the sky is a pretty crazy place. So these tiny birds are, we now know through accelerometer studies, they're moving up and down through air masses, trying to find winds which are moving in the correct direction, the correct land speed. And the availability now of sort of real-time weather data means that, you can sort of be on the east coast of the United Kingdom in autumn, and you're looking, you've seen the weather forecast, and it's an easterly wind, and you're super excited, and then you look at some of these web databases, and suddenly realize that at the height that most birds are migrating, the wind's westerly. And then had you known that, you probably wouldn't have gone to the coast. So we know that birds are moving up and down air masses, and it's quite easy for them to get that wrong and to end up, there might be birds migrating successfully above them, and they're suddenly stuck in an inappropriate air mass and rapidly heading in the direction they don't want to be going. And if that happens when you're over water, then you're in real trouble. And again, lots of satellite tagging studies. Depends on the bird, right? Some waders are so hardcore they can fly straight through a hurricane, things like Hudsonian wimbrels. But for most species, they're going to have to fly downwind with those winds and end up often massively out of range. So again, we were super lucky last autumn in UK and Ireland, and I guess there was black and white warbler in Belgium as well. Was any North American land birds? None made it to here, did it? Or was that a bad to talk about? You've got a spectacled eye. What more do you want? So yeah, we were blessed. Well, I say we were blessed. I didn't even see anything. I've not even seen a North American land bird in Britain since I've had a Northern Harrier about 15 years ago, which shows that it's a bit of an aside, right? If there's any young folks in the audience, if you want to be a birder, don't get into academia because you just send other people to go out birding for you, which is the sorry state of affairs, really. But anyway, I got to lead a paper about a bunch of things which I never saw, and we were able to combine sort of weather radar data and migration flow data from birdcast to sort of try and understand what had happened. And what we found was evidence for quite an exceptional displacement from Hurricane Lee of birds to the north, which are then entrained in a very rapidly moving, easterly heading airflow, which ended up moving these birds incredibly quickly across the North Atlantic. It was also a storm which occurred very early in the season, so it brought lots of exciting species which weren't just grey-cheeked thrushes and weren't just blackpoll warblers, but Blackburnian warblers and Canada warblers and all these exciting birds. Early in the season, and what was also probably extremely important was not only did this air mass move very fast, but there was very little rain, so survivorship for birds was quite high as well. And we probably have similar systems previously, right? But I guess what makes a difference now is that news travels so fast, mobility of birders in UK and Ireland, so many more sites being checked, etc., etc. And what was incredible was that actually the epicenter of this fall was in sort of South Wales. So birds came on a very narrow band, and places like the Isles of Scilly, which historically would get the lion's share of records, actually had relatively few birds from that, where there were sort of first, seconds, and thirds from Britain, all from South Wales. So the birds were clearly travelling together in a relatively small air mass. And people talked about last autumn as being this sort of classic autumn as well, with all these records, but almost everything arrived in this one event. And in fact, there were relatively few birds arriving after that, to be honest. It was more of a typical autumn after that. There was a late arrival of grey-cheeked thrushes, and looking at body masses of birds, things like red-eyed vireos, several were trapped, and birds that were being detected here were all weighed like 21 grams and had clearly been in the UK for quite a while, and they weren't new migrants or anything else, and we could fairly robustly say that they were likely associated with this earlier event. So I alluded as well to space weather as being this disruptor. So really exciting paper came out. Again, where are we here? 2023, again, 2 years ago, using sort of migration flow data. Was able to show that the consequence of these disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field have sort of real-world implications for migrating birds. So birds have sort of the choice of 4 different compasses, if you like, and many species are heavily reliant on the ability to navigate using the Earth's magnetic field as a primary compass mechanism. If you imagine you've got a star compass as well, and if it's cloudy, you can't use that. Sun compass, etc., etc. So when we have these sort of periods of disturbance, it seems that a lot of birds choose not to migrate because they can't orientate correctly. But if birds are migrating, then potentially they're more likely to end up as vagrants. So there was actually a paper that preceded that one, came out in the same year, a correlative study showing that rates of vagrancy were higher during these periods of magnetic disturbance. So again, there seems to be an extraterrestrial driver of vagrancy, which isn't perhaps something which we would have thought of 20 years ago or so now, and perhaps in the near future we'll be able to have a much better sort of predictive ability even to think about what might occur, sort of where and when perhaps. I'm sort of waiting for sort of some blockbuster papers to come out that might look at some of the sort of terrestrial drivers of vagrancy, to do with sort of geomagnetic anomalies, if you like, which do occur across the Earth's surface as well. And so there's people like Thomas Allastam have said, 30 years ago, that expect that there's some geomagnetic areas of the Earth where you may have regions of anomalies which may be important drivers of vagrancy. So again, we're probably getting closer and closer to that. The question of where then, well, everyone knows this, right? Concentration effects, people gravitate to islands, and the birds do as well. Habitat choices, gulls are easier to find than pipits, right? Simply because the amount of habitat available for lost birds to find is more limited, and especially historically, you get records of glaucous winged gull will be tracked around virtually every landfall in the United Kingdom, right? They've shut most of those now, so rates of discovery of gulls are seemingly going down, whereas other species are incredibly hard to find, and then they may have behavioural traits like a lanceolated warbler which make them harder to find still. So detectability is obviously an important question. The island of Faroe, which is here, still maintains this sort of monopoly on European occurrences of lanceolated warbler. For a long time, I would have sort of assumed that that's definitely just because it's the Faroe has virtually no habitat, has lots of birders. But maybe it is also because there are fewer individuals of this species occurring further south. And we see these sort of north-south drop-offs in species which are not skulking birds. Arctic warbler, Philoxylus borealis, for instance, is way too rare in Spain compared to the United Kingdom than would be expected if we were just getting trickled down, if we were getting based on the ratios of things like yellow-browed warblers. So clearly there's something going on with the innate headings that these birds are going on, which means there are changes, there are biases and big regional differences in rates of vagrancy, even within Europe. If you can't get obviously to an oceanic island, then headlands are a key one, especially if you've got a headland which has got very little habitat on it, then you've obviously got a great place to find vagrants. And then even urban parks. I'm not sure if we've got, this is a phenomenon I sort of first came across as an undergrad in the US, especially in Southern California, where the best, short of going to the Farallon Islands, the best place to go would be within these conurbations, these tiny islands of habitat, which function as habitat islands. Anything comparable here, I guess, within... No one found a sort of really good habitat patch, in fact, consistently found vagrants. I can say for my troubles that this is my university here in Manchester, and I was lucky enough a couple of years ago to find a Blythe's reed warbler in November in a snowstorm. And I was sort of lucky enough to find that bird. I had a visiting PhD student come over to see me, and we just had got some lunch from this building, came out here. She was from Brazil, it was snowing, and never seen a bird in the Palearctic. And the first bird we saw was this little Acrocellus warbler, which was pretty crazy, especially as I didn't have any binoculars with me. And then I had to I saw this bird and heard it calling. And the incredible thing is that I sort of knew it was a Blythe's reed because we knew the tack call and it looked good, right, even to the naked eye. And yet it was only 30 years before that that people in the UK, Richard Millington and I guess Steve Ganlett, first identified a Blythe reed in the field. So things have changed so much, our knowledge of birds, that suddenly Blythe reed isn't something you needed a test tube or a bird in the hand. It's something you could identify in November in Western Britain without a pair of binoculars. So thinking about the changes in knowledge. Anyway, in the same area, I've also found Siberian chiffchaff and yellow-browed warbler, and this is just a random area in Western Britain, which isn't terribly good for finding rare birds. But it goes to show that these habitat effects are very, very real. The last part of my talk is just talking about, well, who should care? And obviously, all of us care because we like to see rare birds. And sort of quick ode to Arnoud here. I stole his photo off Facebook, and I remember Arnoud, I think he probably gave me a copy of this book for about £5 at the bird fair, probably about a 40% or 80% discount or something when I was about 11 years old. And so, certainly a Bible for me. So just a quick nod to Arnoud there. So who should care? We care because we're interested in rare birds, but it's not just our sort of hats on as being birders. I think we should have our hats on as being ecologists as well. And there are many reasons why these sort of occasional events may be incredibly important over sort of eco-evolutionary timescales. I'll mention again in a minute the idea of that some species may be founding new routes, the idea that sometimes impacts can be negative. So there was a really cool study a few years ago on McGillivrary's prions, vagrancy of peregrines to the South Atlantic, probably facilitated by boats, because they'll get on boats. There was even Eleonora's falcon, I think, from the Kerguelen archipelago a few years ago. I think that's in the book as well. But boats may assist sort of long-distance vagrancy, and then you get a peregrine out in the middle of nowhere, an island where it should never normally get to, and then suddenly it's eating like 20% of one of the rarest seabirds in the world. So you get unusual impacts you wouldn't expect. Dispersal of parasites and disease, probably really important. There's a few interesting examples from Seychelles warblers and some white eyes. What else have we got here? Colonization, speciation, emergence of new reproductive modes, evolution of new migration routes. I want to talk about dispersal of other species, which is something that's really, really interesting, is that we now have, again, in the last 10 years, we sort of understand this process of endozoochory. So birds, and again, other organisms can disperse viable biological material like seeds or eggs within their own bodies. And so if you think about, well, how do like terrestrial plants or freshwater fish end up getting to places like Hawaii? Well, they almost certainly get there within the bodies of vagrant birds. So even if a mallard ends up from California, ends up in Hawaii, ends up dead on the side of Crater Lake, that may be the start, or is likely the start of, potentially the genesis of an entirely new species, potentially multiple species which may be traveling in or on that mallard. We even know now that waterfowl can disperse viable fish eggs. So even this process of dispersing vertebrates is something which we're just now becoming aware of. And if you think about what we talked about earlier on, we have this sort of gulf in dispersal capacity. 20% of all the world's birds occur exclusively on islands, which only represent about 5% of the Earth's land area. Vagrancy itself can lead to island colonization, which leads to speciation. The opposite of that, in species with very low dispersal rates, like the Cytolopus tabaculos, no vagrancy, which means no dispersal, which also means high speciation on places like tropical mountains. So that gamut of variation in bird dispersal responses is probably incredibly important for accruing bird diversity at global scales. I talked a little bit early on about this concept of pseudo-vagrancy. Again, this is a paper published just after my undergrad with James Gilroy, who's also an author on the book. We produced this table thinking about what the likelihood of these different species being pseudo-vagrants within Europe, ranking richest bibit highest and yellow-brown next. I remember the reviews I got back, which is the first paper I'd ever submitted anywhere to British Birds, and someone said, shorten, tighten, publish and be damned, with this idea that pseudo-vagrancy could be a thing. And the great thing was, it was actually shorten, tighten, publish, be damned, and then 20 years later be proven right by Paul Dufour, that richest bibits really are migrating on a regular basis towards Europe. So we have the geolocator records that these birds are moving from the western edge of their breeding range, and they're going down to the same, being site faithful to the same sites in France and Spain. We've got a cohort of individuals there which are adults. So it seems that we have this phenomenon. In Paul's paper, they suggested that this was potentially a new phenomenon. we actually responded to this paper, arguing that perhaps it's not new, for several reasons. I mean, I can remember Arnoud seeing dozens of Richard's bibits in the 1980s down in Morocco, for instance. But what is really interesting is that this man with the greatest beard in ornithology here, Heinrich Gatke, he was saying that, he was seeing up to 100 Richard's bibits a day on Helgoland 100 years ago, which suggests to me that, and if you read his book, which is available for free on Biodiversity Heritage Library, he also pours scorn on all ornithologists in the rest of Europe that no one can find yellow-browed warblers. Like, I went out this morning and saw 6 of them, and then there's only 2 records in the UK ever, etc. So Gatke was sort of a man ahead of his time at detecting these things, and he even said that maybe these individuals were migrating to as yet unknown wintering grounds in southern Europe. So to be honest, Gatke got there way before we did. Another example, how are we doing for time, by the way? I'm almost wrapping up.
You've got 10 minutes left.
10 minutes, brilliant. So lesser black-backed gull, I did an undergrad degree 1 year of an undergrad degree in California. I twitched a lesser black-backed gull, which had a name, Chester, in Connecticut. I had family living sort of upstate there, so even though I went to California, I spent a couple of weeks out there. So I twitched this lesser black-backed gull called Chester, right? No one names lesser black-backed gulls in Chester now. Well, no one names lesser black-backed gulls in North America because there are hundreds of them. You can go to a beach in Florida and see 800 lesser black-backed gulls. So obviously that phenomenon, has anyone named this Ida yet? We have a name for that? I imagine it could probably easily put a proposal for the BORC that we could rename the English name as Brillida as well, because I mean, it's pretty amazing given how many people have been. Anyway, this massive change in status of lesser black-backed gull is correlated with an increase on a colonization even of Greenland, basically. And the tracking data basically shows that these birds from these new colonies in Greenland are now moving down to new wintering areas in eastern North America. And so these birds initially almost certainly came from Iceland. And what we've got here is the genesis of a new migration route, and probably in the not too distant future, the evolution of a new subspecies, right? There will be no connectivity, almost certainly between this population and this one here, so we will have, in the fullness of time, a new Nearctic subspecies of lesser black-backed gull, if that population persists, right? That's a big if. And there's obviously dynamism, and even things like the Richard's bibit, that nascent population may be wiped out very easily by some severe weather event or whatever. But we can assume that given that birds have to respond and have previously responded to global change, that these sort of vagrants as propagules are incredibly important for persistence of species over evolutionary time. This bird's already got all the way down to to Brazil, for instance. We published the first record. Well, second record was actually the first, because after that I suddenly saw the first record, which was a kelp gull, which is possibly even a kelp gull not of the New World subspecies, but the African one as well. So that's another paper for another day. But anyway, they're now quite rare, even quite regular, even in places like French Guiana. The incredible example now is that obviously we've now got this sort of evidence of this multiple pairs of elegant terns nesting in Spain. So a bird which is really from a hemisphere away is now got a tiny sort of toehold as a breeder in Europe. And again, also gene flow then within sandwich terns. So you've got elegant tern genes floating around the genome of sandwich terns. So again, these sorts of impacts, even if the colonization was a failure, there are genetic legacy impacts which will persist, for potentially a very, very long time. And so this is another paper which I wish I'd written myself, which argued that vagrants are important, and we need to recognize this importance in legislation as well. And you think, well, what's the relevance of this? But 2 examples here. This is a rose-crowned fruit dove, which was basically boarded a boat off New Zealand. An incredible example of vagrancy in a migratory, an intertropical migrant a bird. This bird ended up being euthanized as a biosecurity risk. Here we have a Nicobar pigeon, which was the first record from Australia. This species is basically the most closely related thing there are to dodos. Again, sort of almost a bit of a super tramp species. There was a record from northwest Australia. This bird ended up in bird prison, basically, for the same reason. It was seen as being a problem, right? And Australia has big problems with biosecurity, huge problems with introduced species, but we shouldn't be putting these sort of bird movements into that same category of birds which we are moving around, because fundamentally biota needs to adjust in this period of massive sort of global change. So pushing that message, I think, is itself really, really important. Anyway, I've been speaking for a very long time, so myself and James, who here has sort of been my partner in writing a lot of these papers over the last couple of decades. We've written this book. There may or may not still be a couple of copies out there. Never write a book, to be honest, because you don't sell many copies. I should have written something on another guide to common British birds, because it's a very, very niche market. But I hope you enjoy the book, which basically talks through examples of vagrancy throughout the sort of avian, throughout the entire clade of birds, and proposes some of these mechanisms. But again, it's already out of date because there's another huge slew of new papers to come out. So if you don't buy it, I'll probably revisit it in 10 years' time, and it'll hopefully be a lot more interesting. Anyway, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Alex. We do have time for a few questions. I can imagine there will be a few. Yeah, we would prefer to have the questions in English as well. If it's too hard, we can translate it. But does anyone has a question for Alex? Yes, see somewhere over here. Could you pass on the microphone?
Thanks for a really fantastic talk. I have two questions basically, but they are the same question with different situations. What do you expect with the shifting North Pole, and what do you expect with the decline of the Arctic sea ice to happen in general with vagrancy in birds? Can you summarize? Are there studies out there?
I guess we're on the cusp of understanding some of that change in the position of the zero declination line. So there's an expectation that where there's parts of the Earth where you basically haven't got a difference between sort of magnetic north and actual north, and if birds need to understand, they have to perceive this difference to be able to orientate correctly. So those sorts of shifts may lead to populations of birds suddenly not being able to migrate as well. So that's my best guess at that. But there are people working on that question, so I don't want to give away too. I may or may not have reviewed papers on this recently. But that's sort of exciting times there. The sea ice, I'd imagine we could also be seeing major changes there. For instance, a couple of years ago, there were huge numbers of short-tailed shearwaters, which were a long way into sort of the Northwest Territories almost. Recent records of things like the Eider, for instance, might well be attributed to some of these things. I'm always reticent to give a straight answer to that, because if you actually look at all the records of some of these high Arctic species, I mean, there are sort of 19th and early 20th century records of things like crested auklets and some of the Pacific sea birds. So we don't really have a significant data set yet, but it sort of stands to reason that change in habitat extent and the ability of birds to be occupying those areas late in the season, or for those areas to be entirely ice-free, would permit vagrancy, and especially if you've got boats moving around, then gulls following things. I mean, a lot of the records, for instance, of Pacific Northwest gulls, it wouldn't surprise me if it's really a consequence of birds adapting to use landfill and then being drawn ever sort of eastwards in North America. The closure of those landfill sites may even change rates of vagrancy as well. So I think any of these aspects of global change may lead to increasing or decreasing rates of vagrancy, yeah.
Thanks.
All right, no more questions for Alex?
Normally in the UK, everyone wants to know about certain decisions, but I'm glad I don't have to opine about any of those things.
Yeah.
No one's going to throw potatoes at me for booted eagles or something.
No, they definitely won't. No, but I want to thank you so much for this incredible speech, Alex. Can I have one big last applause for him? I got you the questions.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Alright, dan is het nu tijd voor lunch voordat we gaan beginnen.